Register for BetMGM using bonus code USA600, and your first bet will be risk-free up to $600. That means if you lose your first wager, you'll get it back in free bets for another chance at the action. Bet fearlessly on college basketball's March matchups and all your favorite sports at BetMGM, the king of sportsbooks. New customer offer, paid in free bets. Must be 21 years or older to present in Colorado. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700.
There's only one authority on the Tennessee Titans, and that's the Tennessean. And there's only one show that's an authority too, and you found it. This is Talkin' Titans.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. We've been away for a little bit. For those of you who have listened to us on the Titans before, you first off, thank you. We appreciate that, and the fact that you're back now. But kind of a new era when it comes to the Titans coverage for the Tennessean. You may remember my former colleague on these podcasts, Eric Bacharach, has moved on, and I am pleased to introduce you to his replacement. Everybody, I'd like you to meet Ben Arthur, the new Titans beat writer for the Tennessean. Ben, talk about yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I'm really excited to, kind of get going with you all, getting to know Nashville, getting to know the Titans. So, exciting next step in the journey for me. Just so you all you Titans fans, NFL fans know about me. So I am from Seattle, and so I am coming to Nashville from there, where I was covering the Seahawks primarily for the past 3 seasons. So if you have any Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf, those type of questions down the line, be more than happy to kind of share what I know. But, that was kind of like my area of expertise where I was at, SeattlePI.com, a digital only news publication, a former newspaper that went all online. So that's where I'm coming to the Tennessean from, and, ready to, kind of get going. I actually haven't moved to Nashville as of the recording of this podcast, but I will be in the next week. So can't wait to get down there.
So have you found a place to live? You still looking?
I have found a place to live. Huge sigh of, relief. I'm actually going to be close to the Titans practice facility, which I know is, where I'm going to be most of the time during the season. So, really good setup I have for me in Nashville waiting for me.
We're all real thrilled to have been on board. And, I think we've got a good show for you. We're going to talk a lot of draft stuff. Obviously, we're a couple of weeks out from the NFL draft. We're going to have a guest, and Chase Goodbread from NFL.com is going to join us to talk a little bit about some of the prospects and, who could fall to the Titans at that number 22 spot. Before we get there, though, Ben, there's something I've always wondered, and you have a unique perspective as somebody who's covered the league, but, not in Nashville. When you come into this beat, what was your perception of the Titans as a franchise, and what do you think other people's perception of the Titans as a franchise are?
Yeah, I think, definitely in Seattle, whenever Titans comes up, it's really just because of, Derrick Henry and just the feats he's been able to, accomplish the last couple of years, obviously with the 2,000-yard rushing season last year. But being all the way on the West Coast, definitely kind of small, like a smaller market and NFL franchise. At least that was, kind of the perspective I was getting from afar, and something I was hearing a lot, about it in Seattle was just like how efficient this Titans offense was, with Arthur Smith, who's obviously moved on to be the head coach of the Falcons, but just how balanced they were. Obviously, I heard about how, Ryan Tannehill came on board in Tennessee and really rejuvenated his career, had a renaissance of sorts. What A.J. Brown has become as a number 1 receiver. He's actually a guy that I should add has, come up quite a bit just because of DK Metcalf, the Seahawks star receiver. They were, college teammates at Ole Miss, and they're super close. So A.J. Brown actually came up in a lot of discussions and whatnot, but really that balance of the Titans offense was really something that jumped out to me from afar. Their ability they had a 2,000-yard rusher and then a 1,000-yard receiver. And then, what Ryan Tannehill was able to do in kind of his second phase of his career. So Those would be, some of the things that would jump out to me the most about what, at least my experience with the Titans from afar in Seattle.
Yeah, and you're joining the Titans beat at an interesting time, I think. It's been a minute on the podcast, so a lot's kind of happened since our last edition of Talking Titans. We're not going to do that again, by the way. We're going to make this a more regular thing with Ben on board. And like I say, this one's going to delve more into the draft. But just as a quick recap, I think kind of the headline of the last few months to me was Mike Vrabel's decision to promote Shane Bowen to defensive coordinator after a season that quite honestly was not very good on that side of the ball. I think everybody knows that. And so maybe not the most popular decision for him to do that. He also promoted to replace Arthur Smith on the offensive side of the ball, Todd Downing, who was Arthur's replacement as tight ends coach. To me, I think both of those were gambles. They were a bit questionable moves in both cases, but especially I think the Shane Bowen move invited a lot of criticism. Interesting, Ben, to note recently, we talked to Mike Vrabel about this, and he was pretty defensive. I mean, not only did he not want to talk about Shane Bowen in that role, he really bristled at the idea that he was being questioned. He didn't want to give any details. And then a couple of days later, he announces he's hired Jim Schwartz as to a mysterious role on the defensive side of the ball that is not coordinator. So what's your take on that? And what do you think he's going to actually be doing?
Yeah, that's a very interesting situation. It's really going to be a wait and see thing, right? Like just really how it all works. From the outside looking in, obviously as media people, and then I know the fans as well. It's like, what is going on with this Shane Bowen promotion to a role he was kind of already serving at a de facto capacity, but then you already had the defense was bad. Like they couldn't get off the field. The pass rush was obviously awful. And, it just didn't work without Dean Pease, who's actually now joining Arthur Smith in Atlanta, which was a, interesting twist, when that news came out. But it's going to be really fascinating to see, how exactly this all works out, right? Because Vrabel has given the formal title of defensive coordinator to Shane Bowen at this point, but what is really going to change? And then when you bring in a guy like Jim Schwartz, who has more experience than Vrabel and Bowen actually combined, it's 14 years of defensive coordinating experience. He was obviously head coach of the Lions as well. DC for the Titans, kind of back in the day too. Like what's kind of like what are those defensive meetings, going to be like, when things are going south, like who's going to be kind of like the primary voice, right? From what, I know Kevin, Byard had been talking that, and I believe other players as well had been saying that, and Vrabel too, that Bowen led the meetings and all that, even though he was the outside linebackers coach. He didn't have that formal defensive coordinator role, but now he has that. But look, like if the issues are still there, how is the communication going to work, right? And what's kind of the leadership hierarchy in terms of, who's going to be looked at to kind of solve the issue. So I think that's going to be a wait and see type of thing, Gentry, to be honest with you. It's really hard to say, what exactly will happen with that. And then obviously we haven't had the chance to speak with Vrabel since the Jim Schwartz hire was announced. So, I'm sure he'll elaborate at length about everything.
Yeah. I mean, here's what I don't understand about this. And I didn't understand this last year when the whole, Shane Bowen isn't the coordinator, but he is kind of when Vrabel's not there and he is. Yeah. Why so complicated? I don't understand why any of this has to be so complicated. If you have Jim Schwartz on your staff, a guy, as you noted, so experienced, make him the coordinator. Why wouldn't you? I mean, assuming he wanted to do that, why would you do that? Why would you complicate this to where you would even invite the suggestion that people don't know what everyone else in the building is doing? And I feel like look, here's how the meetings are going to go among the coaches. Mike Vrabel is going to say, here's what we're doing. And everybody in the room is going to go, okay, coach, because I think that's what Mike Vrabel wants to have happen. I truly believe that. It was interesting that he gets Jim Schwartz on staff as somebody who would have some expertise and maybe be able to tell him something he didn't want to hear. And if that happens, and that's something that the Titans are able to have this year and their staff that they did not have last year, then I think that's a huge addition. That if there's somebody that Vrabel trusts in that way that he probably trusted Dean Pease to be able to tell him, no, coach, we don't need to do that. If that's all he does, this was a great addition for the Titans and something they needed, because I do feel like, look, no knock on Shane Bowen. I don't put what happened last year on Shane Bowen any more than I do Kevin Byard or a lot of the players. They didn't have a coordinator. If you really thought Shane Bowen was capable of running your defense, then why wasn't he running your defense? Why would you withhold the coordinator title from him when surely he'd want it because he's got it now? It just never made a lot of sense. And, if you're a player on that defense, you go into last season thinking that Mike Vrabel is your defense coordinator because he is. And now you have someone else in that role, so we'll see how it plays out. The one thing, Ben, that I do agree with, and I'm just kind of going on and on here, people are like, talk about the draft. But the one thing to me on all this is I just feel like I do agree with him that it was the players. And I hate to say that a little bit because I think that's kind of been knocked from the standpoint this offseason of I think John Robinson, Mike Vrabel, the actions they've made have been like, well, we didn't think it was the coaches. We thought it was the players. And I hate to agree with that, but I do. When you were looking at that team last year, the defense they put on the field against the Ravens, you had some real fringe NFL guys out there. And you had, a guy like Breon Borders, I thought overachieved dramatically as a cornerback last year. But how's he in your top two? I mean, this guy had been cut from 7 different teams. He was an undrafted free agent. If he was that good, he would have caught on one of those 7 places. I hate to say that. Love Breon Borders. Talked to him last year. Did a long story on him. Think he's a great guy. But once you're having to depend on him as a top 2 corner, that shouldn't be happening for a team as good as the Titans. You're having to depend on Wyatt Ray, guys like that, to produce a pass rush. They needed more than they had on that side of the ball, and I think injuries played a part of it. But and I think that's what they're trying to address.
Getting you what you needed, and then just being out of the picture after 8 games, and then Vic Beasley, that situation, man, that was really bad. And you invest money in these guys, and they don't really pan out, and then that leads to a situation where you do have to have those fringe guys out there, like you mentioned, and obviously the injury situation kind of just compounded on top of that, and made for a bad situation. So we'll see kind of how it goes, and we'll see what they do in the draft, but they're kind of starting over, right? I mean, now they're bringing in another outside backer, edge rushing type in Bud Dupree, who's coming over from Pittsburgh, who they hope will fix part of the issue. But then it's like also too, it's like he's coming off an ACL injury, and you just don't know exactly what you're getting from him, specifically right from the jump. And so that'll be interesting. And then Danico Autry, very productive D lineman over at the divisional rival Colts too. So we'll kind of see what they bring to the table too. But yeah, it was very bad from a defensive standpoint, from a personnel defensive standpoint, I should say. And so yeah, let's see if they can hit it in the draft.
Yep, that perfect segue. Yeah, we go right to that. It does make you wonder. Okay, the Titans are picking at 22. I think everybody kind of assumed edge rusher. That was the one for the longest that everyone said, okay, that's the clear need. That's something they're going to need. Signing Bud Dupree, you're letting go Malcolm Butler, Adoree Jackson. Now Corey Davis goes to the Jets. There are other needs that have become more prominent, most notably cornerback and wide receiver. So I think, Ben, what you've seen in a lot of the mock drafts so far, and we'll talk about ours here in a second, but there's been either those 3 positions really for the Titans: corner, receiver, edge rusher. I tend to put edge rusher third on that list now. I think they could still get one, but I think that would have to do more with how the first round falls, because corner and wide receiver both look pretty top heavy. They look like they've got some top guys that are going to be gone pretty quick. And edge rusher doesn't. Edge rusher looks more there. It's not as top heavy. They're going to have some guys late first, early second that are going to be available. The Titans are basically going to have their pick of several guys, I think, at that spot if they want to go that way. But if you're talking corner, wide receiver, and you're at 22, it might be a situation where you're going to have to reach for somebody you really like at one of those two positions, or you're going to have to hope somebody falls for you unless you want to trade up. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Ben and I both agreed, and we didn't talk about this ahead of time either. We both agreed in our latest mock drafts. We've each done them, and we had the same player mocked to the Titans in our most recent mock draft.
Yeah, we did not talk about this at all. It just kind of happened. You know, Caleb Farley out of Virginia Tech, corner, who opted out of the 2020 season. The first player to actually opt out of the season because of COVID concerns. And you know, the reason, you know, you'll go ahead and kind of explain your reasoning for you know, mocking him to the Titans, Gentry, but to kind of give my perspective, right? Like, you know, the belief, the consensus is that, you know, Farley is kind of a top dog at corner, like a tier 1 CB1 type, you know, aggressive, great size, you know, playmaker, all that. But then you look at the injury history, you know, he had the micro discectomy, I'm probably mispronouncing that, the back procedure in the spring, you know, which people were kind of concerned about. And then I also know in the 2019 season, the last season he actually played, he missed a couple games because of the last 2 games because of also a back issue. And then he had a torn ACL early in his career at Virginia Tech. So there are kind of like health and durability concerns there, which I think makes him, you know, more likely than some of the other top corners, you know, at the top of the draft to kind of fall in the Titans range. So that's kind of why I have him penciled in at number 22, you know, at least for now. And so yeah, we'll kind of see how it all shakes on draft day. But I think Farley's a really, you know, interesting prospect too, in that he's only been playing corner for 2 years, because, you know, he didn't have the 2020 season because of opting out. The 2019 season is what kind of people are basing off his potential and upside off of. And 2018 was his first year really playing corner, because he was a quarterback in high school, like a dual threat guy. And then he came in to Virginia Tech to potentially play receiver, but then that didn't really work out. And then he had the injury, ACL injury, and then he switched over to defense. So, you know, I think there's a lot of upside there. I think there's a lot of potential there. And because of the health and durability concerns, you know, I think kind of the mixture of all those factors makes him the most likely top corner to kind of slide into the Titans range.
If you're the Titans, I'm not sure you let a guy that good get past you at 22. And I think we're going to talk a good bit more about Farley with our guest here in a minute, and Chase Goodbread, a guy who has written about Caleb Farley and knows a bit about his story. And I think that's a win if you're able to get him. I think, you know, it's a back issue though. And there are some red flags. The one thing is that I do wonder how this might affect the Titans this year versus any other year in the draft under John Robinson is what happened last year with Isaiah Wilson. Does that make you more risk averse now than you would have been? Because what's worse than completely blowing a first round pick? Well, completely blowing 2 first round picks. And it does add a lot of pressure that I think probably wouldn't have been there in a normal year, because the Isaiah Wilson bust was spectacularly bad, historically bad, quite honestly, a guy who you barely got on the practice field, much less in a game. We've talked about Isaiah plenty on here, so we're not going to rehash that, but it does make you wonder, does it make you more risk adverse? Are you a lot safer? Because, you know, quite honestly, a lot of the same setup that led to Isaiah's pick is in place now, having to do Zoom calls with prospects, not being able to sit down face to face the way you would have in a normal year. And Look, I don't think there's any of those concerns with Caleb Farley, but a back issue is something that I think is going to give teams a lot of pause. And, for the Titans, there's that issue with Caleb Farley, but, I think the question also picking at 22, if you don't get what you want there, at what point would you look to trade up? At what point would you look to trade back? Because I think if you don't get what you want there, I do think you would be reaching at corner and receiver at those spots, because I think you got guys that are probably going to be gone. Farley is the one that could fall. But I feel like J.C. Horn at South Carolina is kind of taken his spot as that other top guy with Surtain at Alabama. And so I think those corners could all go. And I think the receivers with Chase and the two at Alabama, Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith, they could all go too. So I don't think it'd be the worst move if they did trade back and it came to that. I also don't think it'd be the worst move if Devontae Smith happened to be there at 10 or 11 and 12 and they moved up to get him.
Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to bring up, because when you look at the projections with Devontae Smith, he's kind of all over, right? Like, I've seen him as high as 6 to the Dolphins, but then I've also seen him sliding into the late teens. And, obviously the kind of the weight, the size thing is a concern. With him, even though he was, just phenomenal, at Alabama, just transcendent, type of production and just what he did for that offense, obviously winning the Heisman. Like, if he ends up like in the teens, like mid-teens, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that the Titans, trade up for a guy like that. And I think he'd be and I know you've written about this too, Gentry, but he could be a nice number 2 complement to AJ Brown, with defenses, rolling their coverages over to Brown and all the attention he's going to get. All Devontae, has to do in a lot of situations is beat his guy, in man coverage, in single man coverage. And, he's obviously a guy capable of doing that. So, if he does kind of fall back a bit, I think he's someone that the Titans could potentially trade up for. I think you make a good point about maybe the guys the Titans want maybe aren't there at corner or receiver, and so maybe trade back. Like, I think particularly, with the receiving class, I think there's a lot of late first round, early second round talent. And so even if you don't get what you want at 22, you trade back. I think there'll be so many options available for the Titans there. I know Rashad Bateman from Minnesota has been a popular choice. A guy who can play inside and out. Real solid guy for the Gophers. And then Elijah Moore from Ole Miss, who AJ Brown is vouched for on Twitter already. His former teammate at Ole Miss, a slot guy. In my mock on Tennessee and on the Tennessean website, I had Amari Rogers from Clemson, a Knoxville native, who I think could be, an option in the second round as well. Kadarius Toney, just an explosive, dynamic, like really shifty type of player. He's a really exciting talent. He's a guy I've seen go anywhere from 20 in the mock drafts to the 50s range. So, I think with trading back, the Titans will have, a lot of options. So it's going to, like you said, it's really going to come down to like how everything shakes up in the first 15, 20 picks.
With Kadarius Toney, it's interesting because a lot of the receivers that you're seeing real high, other than Kyle Pitts, a tight end, a lot of the receivers that you're seeing, the two guys from Alabama, talk about Kadarius Toney. We're going to talk to Chase a little bit about Rondale Moore. These guys are all undersized, and there's some questions. They're all similar players, and I think one thing that's kind of hurt Kadarius Toney is he's kind of being rated behind the two Alabama guys, even though. And I think Devontae Smith's phenomenal. I don't see anyone who could watch last season and not think that. But I think Toney, you mentioned, if he falls into the second round, I think I think that's a steal for somebody. I do. I think that guy is a first-round talent. He's a playmaker with what he was able to do with Dan Mullen at Florida. Another guy you mentioned I like a lot is Bateman from Minnesota. When you watch him, that guy can play. There's ball skills. There's a lot there that is impressive and I think would fit very well with what the Titans want to do. I feel like the backstory on him a little bit, and I had no idea, Ben, until I really looked into this. That dude is from Tifton, Georgia, which I know you're up in Seattle and you don't really know where Tifton, Georgia is, but it's down there. It's way down there near the Florida line in South Georgia. And I found it fascinating that a guy from Tift County ends up going to Minnesota. And the reason he did was because he was overlooked as a prospect in high school. PJ Fleck from Minnesota was showing some interest. And as the story goes, Rashad told him, look, coach, if you offer me, I'll commit. So he did. And he did. And then he blew up his senior year. I think had best numbers or one of the best seasons in the state of Georgia as a high school senior. And the local schools, they got wise to it at that point. Georgia and other schools began to recruit him. He stayed with Minnesota. And as somebody who has covered lots of college football recruiting, that is really rare for a kid to do that, because that to me says a lot about the type of person you would be drafting with Rashad Bateman. The loyalty he showed to still go to Minnesota, not play in the SEC at Georgia or Auburn or wherever. He stuck with Minnesota and to go all the way up there. And not only that, I've seen interviews where he says he loves it. He wants to live there, after his football career is over. So, just kind of an interesting side note there. We're going to bring in our guests now to kind of join in the conversation that we've had to this point. All right. We are now joined by one of my very favorite people in the business, a guy I've known a really long time, Chase Goodred from NFL.com. Chase, how's it going? How's the draft prep? You ready to get this done in a couple weeks?
Ready to get past it. Yeah, no doubt about it. Doing fine though. Coming down the stretch here. I'm working on kind of finishing up one last long form that I'm going to file before the draft, and then after that, it's a new cycle of prospects for me.
Just to explain a little bit, Chase has maybe the best job of anybody I know in our business in that he gets to go around and really get to know a lot of draft prospects leading in and really tell their stories. And I'm telling you, if you don't read what Chase does for NFL.com, you should. I mean, it's must read stuff heading into the draft each year. The stories he's able to uncover and tell about these guys are incredible. And, I'm really glad to have Chase on here to talk about some of those guys. Chase, one of the I read your story on Caleb Farley, who we've been talking about on the podcast here, and it's really an interesting story to me. I think you captured kind of his personality in that, this guy's a leader. He's not a follower. There's so many things he did that, others aren't doing, from sitting out last year he was kind of the first to do that. But he also, you got a guy who's got religious beliefs. So he goes to parties and he's not following the crowd there. And I mean, did you kind of get that sense from him? It's a pretty strong-willed individual.
No doubt about it. Yeah. He definitely marches to his beat with no apologies, and good for him on that. He's a phenomenal athlete, obviously, but beyond that, a guy who's got a lot of strong convictions, and he was strongly had convictions to be the first opt-out, which wasn't an easy thing from the outside, but when you kind of jump in and sit down with him and sit down with his family and talk to him about it, it was a much easier decision for him than I think anyone on the outside would have assumed last summer in late July, when it looked like there might not be college football at all. And, everybody knew that there were going to be some opt-outs by major college players, but no one knew who would be the first. And he didn't mind being the first whatsoever. One of the comments he made to me that I think made the story was that if nobody had followed him, if Micah Parsons and Greg Rousseau and all these other guys who opted out, if none of them had done that and he'd been the only one, wouldn't have bothered him one bit.
And his reasoning was to keep his father safe because he had lost his mother recently, right?
his mother had died shortly after he got to Virginia Tech, right after his redshirt season there in 2017. And it was obviously a devastating loss for him. She succumbed to cancer. And yeah, keeping his father safe from COVID-19 was definitely at the forefront of his mind. And he had some concerns specific to specific to Virginia Tech protocols as well that led him to the decision to go ahead and opt out. And everything that I was able to gather and going to his hometown of Maiden, North Carolina, and Hickory as well. It's near Hickory, which is a little bit bigger town. Was that he was taking COVID really seriously, probably a lot more seriously than most teenagers or college kids, certainly his age, his peer group, than a lot of people might think. And this is even before he opted out. This is during last spring, during the quarantine time. It was no joke to him.
One of the reasons we're talking about Farley, and I probably wouldn't have expected this from the Titans perspective, picking 22, it would have seemed a reach to think they would have had a shot at this kid. I mean, he was being mocked top 10, top dozen, 15, but it does seem recently there's been more of a thought that he could potentially fall into that range. Daniel Jeremiah mocked him to the Titans recently. We've talked about that on our podcast here. And, I know there's back concerns with his health. And I guess when you're talking about a back issue, that's the kind of thing that would cause maybe some bigger red flags and some other things, because that could be a chronic type of situation. The fact he set out last year, he doesn't really have a huge resume from college. I mean, obviously he's got a lot of the measurables, but maybe not the kind of body of work that a Patrick Surtain or JC Horn at South Carolina would have. Do you think he would fall into that range? Do you think it's realistic to think the Titans, who badly need a cornerback, could end up getting a guy that good that late?
I think it is realistic, and you're right. There was a time there where people were suggesting that it was really him and Surtain at the top of the draft at that position, and that he may even be the first cornerback off the board. It looks like that's going to be Surtain at this point, a couple of weeks before the draft. And the back issue definitely, I think, is driving some of this supposed fall for him. He obviously wasn't able to do anything at Pro Day except for interview with clubs. He had been training for Pro Day. So, obviously it wasn't something that he'd known about for a super long time, but, he had a back procedure right around the time of his Pro Day that shouldn't be an issue for him long term at all. But especially this year, I think, with there being no official medical checks at the combine, I think maybe red flags in general in the NFL are maybe raised a little bit higher for this year, because the team doctors maybe aren't as able to get a look at these guys as they normally would. And so, yeah, I think it's conceivable he could slip that far. I think he's absolutely going to be a first rounder. The guy's tape from 2019 is just phenomenal. That's the one year that kind of anchors his draft status. But no doubt about it, I think he's a possibility for Tennessee.
Yeah, some background with Chase and I. We used to cover Alabama together years ago on the same beat. Chase is still in Tuscaloosa, so I feel like I can ask you about Alabama players. I wrote recently that there's some talk. The Titans are kind of in that range. What do they do? Do they trade down? Do they trade up? They may not get what they want at 22. Other than corner, I'd say their biggest need is wide receiver. And I wrote recently, I'm starting to see some of this talk that Devontae Smith could end up falling into the teens or something like that. Concerns about his size and some of these other things. That to me is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. The idea of that happening shows that measurables are run amok in the NFL draft process, and production is not valued nearly enough. Because if he is sitting there at 12, 13, 14, and I'm the Titans needing a number 2 receiver to replace Corey Davis, I would I would move up in a heartbeat to go get that guy. You think I'm crazy? I mean, first off, do you think I'm crazy that he would fall to that level? And in terms of him and Jalen Waddle, who do you think would be the better pro prospect, and who do you think teams view as the better pro prospect?
As good as Devontae Smith is, I like Waddle a little bit more as a pro. And it's going to be interesting to see which of the two goes first. I don't think there's any question that there are some teams that have got Smith ahead of Waddle and some teams that have got Waddle ahead of Smith. He is a phenomenal player, had a phenomenal season, obviously, at Alabama, winning the Heisman and so forth. His ball skills, and he's not the biggest guy, but he plays big, right? If he weighs 180, he blocks like he's 200. If he's 6 feet tall, he goes up in the air for a contested catch like he's 6'2" or 6'3". So he certainly plays above his size, and I think he's going to make a fantastic receiver for somebody. But could he slip out of the top 10? Yeah, I think that's conceivable, and it's not to knock him at all. It's just when you consider that as good as he is he going to go ahead of Kyle Pitts? Probably not. Is he going to go ahead of Jamar Chase? Probably not. Is he going to go ahead of Jalen Waddle? Maybe not. Okay, so as good as he is, right there, we're talking about a possibility of him maybe being the fourth receiver. And I'm counting Pitts as a receiver, frankly, because every team in the NFL looks at him as a receiver more than a tight end. But we're talking about him maybe being the fourth pass catcher drafted. If you're the fourth pass catcher drafted in a draft where the quarterbacks are going to dominate the top 5, then yeah, sure, you could slip out of the top 10.
I think that would, whoever lands him is going to get a guy who years later they're going to look back and say, how in the world was he not one of the top few players picked? I've seen too much of him. I understand the concerns about his size, and you know, a guy going over the middle in the league. I understand all that, but that's just, you know what, Chase, I would have said the same thing about Derrick Henry years ago. And now people look at that and go, how in the world does that guy fall in the second round? I think Najee Harris could have that happen this year, by the way. I think he could end up falling in the second round. And that's another guy that, you know, God, what are you thinking? I understand the value of skill guys necessarily isn't the same as some other positions, but you know, come on. Another guy you wrote about, and I know this guy fairly well because I used to work in Louisville, Kentucky, and I covered him in high school, is Rondell Moore, who I think he's been mentioned with the Titans second, third round, you know, again, needing wide receiver. He's another guy that I think is being overlooked a little bit because of the measurables. He's about, Rondell's what, about 5'7"?
In that neighborhood, yeah.
But this guy is one heck of a playmaker, and you could see it back then. He goes to Purdue, and Jeff Brom's offense his freshman year was unbelievable. And he's a guy that another one that I think people are sleeping on a little bit. What did you make of Rondell and kind of his story and what he can do?
Starting to rain here a bit. I'll apologize if there's any thunder in the background, but I'm staying dry, so no worries about rainwater on a Zoom call. So, yeah, Moore is a guy. He's a classic chip on the shoulder, small athlete, right? Always been told he's too small. Always disproven that pretty much at every level. And I think sometimes he doesn't get credit for how physically strong he is, right? He's not tall at all. He's not really that heavy either. But if you look at some of the things that he was able to do at his pro day, it's obvious that the guy is a dynamo from a strength standpoint. So I think he can break tackles at his size in the NFL. He's built compactly. He's pretty thick. And of course he's not only super fast, but super quick. He's got an ability to change gears a little bit. You know, you mentioned you and I covered Alabama for a long time. Familiar as I am with Alabama football going way back, he reminds me a little bit of David Palmer in his ability. That's going back.
No, that's a good one.
30 years now.
But
one thing David Palmer could do at Alabama was he could change speeds during the play and kind of lull people to sleep. He could stop and start on a dime, but then, he would run 80% and and then hit a jet to 100% and make somebody miss that way. And then he'd gear it down to 40% to make somebody else miss. And Rondale Moore's got that ability, which makes him incredibly fun to watch as a player. And by the way, if there's anything to be said for complementary receivers, right? Having a big guy, having a small guy, having a red zone guy, having a speed guy. What about Brown with Rondale Moore in terms of complementary skill sets?
And Devontae Smith too, man. Can you imagine? I think that second wide receiver spot with the Titans is an absolute gold mine. I think Corey Davis proved it last year. You're talking about defenses that have to deal with Derrick Henry, number one, but then also you have A.J. Brown at that number one spot. And I think Corey Davis had the best year of his career because he wasn't the number one guy anymore. And he was able to take advantage of single coverage. And I think if you put Devontae Smith for sure, but somebody like Rondale Moore in that kind of situation, big numbers, that I would suggest drafting both of them on your fantasy team. So, all right. Well, Chase, Chase, thanks so much. I'll let you get out of the rain there in Tuscaloosa, but I really appreciate you coming on and joining us, man. Always good to talk.
No problem, Gentry. Appreciate it anytime.
All right. Well, that was Chase Goodbread from NFL.com. And I'll repeat what I said there. If you're not reading what he does, you should be. His long form stories on a lot of these players are can't miss stuff every year. They really are. And, especially for a guy like Caleb Farley, who I do think there's a chance can end up in Nashville. But really an interesting look at him. Ben, as we talk about all this stuff, your mock draft recently, you were a lot more ambitious than I was. I'll do the first round, but I'm not sitting there trying to pick who's in the 5th and 6th round. You did all 7 rounds for the Titans. And what did you kind of learn doing that? And when you get to like the 4th or 5th round, are you just kind of, how do you make that decision?
Yeah, it's when you get past like the 3rd round, it gets really, really tough. And you just kind of have to lean on, I mean, there's so much great analysis, film study on a lot of, kind of the guys projected to go in, the later rounds, there was from the Athletic, the Beast, that massive draft guide that I think Dane Brugler. My apologies if I'm butchering his name, but he has a really awesome and extensive detail on every single prospect, from early that's projected to go early and all the way to late. 7th round and priority free agent guys. And so, resources like that, I kind of use to help, of course. But then, it's just, looking at, some of the other, Titans needs and just, figuring out, who could potentially, be available, like these older, upperclassmen from these Power 5 schools who aren't getting the same, kind of attention as obviously the early round guys, but just guys who are, who may go in that range, or guys who, had injuries, and have seen their stock, dip a bit. And so it's really a lot of resources I use to kind of help me kind of really expand to get like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round, projections, and then just kind of leaning on what I saw at the Senior Bowl, as well. I think that really helped me too. But Gentry, it was tough, man. It was really tough, but it's so beyond hard to project, picks that late into the draft. I mean, so many things can happen, and you just kind of have to pick a guy who's maybe, sliding under the radar, or an older guy, like I said, or something like that. And hopefully, so hopefully, my 7-round mock kind of made sense for people in the later rounds, but that's kind of what happened with that.
Yeah, it's tough to. It's important, I think, when you think about what the Titans might do in the first round, to look at how deep these spots are. Wide receiver, I think, is pretty deep. I think it was deep last year. It was deep in free agency. I think that the point being, it's not as difficult to find a legit wide receiver 2 as I think it would be to find a legit first or second cornerback. I think there's probably more value at that spot given what else you're going to find in the draft, but you could find guys that could help you. I think last year there was some surprise that, say what you want about Isaiah Wilson and how that worked out. But at the time I kind of questioned the pick, just because why are you picking a tackle? You knew last year that the Titans, most of their holes were on the defensive side of the ball. They had re-signed Dennis Kelly, and you kind of assumed, okay, that's Jack Conklin's replacement. They're going to have a right tackle, and he ended up being the right tackle because Isaiah wasn't able to help him. But when you see that pick, last year they picked a tackle in the first round and a running back in the third round. They were able to get Christian Fulton, which I thought was a pretty clutch thing for the Titans, that Christian Fulton was still available after they passed on corner in the first round. But to go offense on 2 of your first 3 picks, I really don't think the Titans can continue to do that. I feel like, it's going to be so tough because there's such a give and take here, because you need a receiver, you need a tight end. And I don't think they're in a position where they're going to go grab a tight end or trade up and get Kyle Pitts or anything in the first round. But I think by the time you get to that 3rd or 4th round, you need to be thinking about that, because I don't see a tight end 1 on their roster right now. Anthony Ferks or Jeff Swaim, great. They're good for what you need them to be, but they are not Jonnu Smith. And I don't know if they're going to be able to draft a Jonnu Smith. So you kind of pencil in that 3rd round pick. Looks like tight end to me, maybe 4th at the latest, but you're going to have to do something. There just aren't tight ends available on the market right now. And then, okay, well, if you take a receiver in the first round, tight end in the 3rd round, now you got two out of your first 3 picks are offensive players again. It's tough. It's a tough give and take here. And it's kind of been the theme to this whole offseason for the Titans is how much better can they make their defense without hurting their offense and there's that's just it. It's how expendable are some of their offensive pieces in order to do what they need to do on defense.
Yeah, it's a unique situation the Titans are in, just because they needed coming into this offseason, they needed so much help on defense, but that they also have really key positions that they need to fill on offense. I mean, they were arguably, if not the most balanced offense in the NFL, and obviously the offense is kind of it's the thing for the Titans right now in terms of leading the team. They're on Derrick Henry's back, and all that, and the offense is leading the way for this team, and so you need to make sure you're right on offense, although you have all these defensive issues that you need to address, and so it is tough. So with the draft, it's going to be interesting how they look at all those priorities, right? Like juggling the need for defensive talent now, and then also the need for starter, guys that they can just plug in on offense right away. And so, in terms of their top 3 picks, at least I'd say one is for offense, that top pick in the first round, regardless of what they do with it. I think it could be wide receiver, and then the other 2 defense. But who knows? Maybe, we've talked kind of a little bit about the Isaiah Wilson fiasco. Maybe, who knows? Maybe they go right tackle first.
That wouldn't shock me, actually, not after last year.
I don't think it would really shock anyone. And the right tackle spot isn't really set. I mean, Dennis Kelly's obviously gone. They released him, which I think shocked a lot of people. And right now the way it's set up, Kendall Lim and Ty Sombrello are kind of set to kind of hold the fort down. But you still need a long-term option. I mean, those are just kind of stopgap options. So where does that kind of put right tackle on the priority list, right? Does that maybe it doesn't warrant the first round pick, but maybe use that second round pick on a right tackle, and maybe that third round pick. So yeah, the balance of needing the defense to improve a ton on top of needing the offense to still be really, really great, I think is a really interesting dynamic the Titans have to work with entering the draft.
Yeah, and seems to me you have more needs than you have picks, at least in those first couple of days. Trade down. The answer to that would be to trade down.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that'll do it for this edition of Talking Titans. Thanks for joining us. We hope you'll subscribe to Tennessean.com if you haven't already. Remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, wherever it is you get your podcasts. Drop us a review and a rating while you're at it. For Ben Arthur, I'm Gentry Estes. Thanks so much for listening.
Peace out, guys.
Talkin' Titans hosts each Thursday at Tennessean.com. You can also subscribe to Talkin' Titans for free on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. I'm Sean King. Talkin' Titans is a production of the Tennessean.